That the president concealed his private conversations with Vladimir Putin from his own government landed like a bombshell this week, and especially after it was revealed that Trump was investigated as a suspected Russian agent and could still be under that scrutiny. Well, now the New York Times is reporting that, quote, the mystery surrounding the meeting seems to have drawn attention from the special counsel Robert Mueller. Since taking office, the president has met with Putin a total of 5 times. There they are, in 4 different countries. As the Washington Post first reported, the president went on as far as to confiscate the notes of his own interpreter after his exchange with Putin in that G20 meeting up in Hamburg, Germany. And while at dinner that night, Trump had another conversation with Putin. There he is, without an American interpreter even present. Cameras were briefly able to capture the president gesturing at Putin way across the table, pumping his fist in an apparent attempt to get his attention. However, it was Trump's infamous 2-hour meeting with Putin in Helsinki, Finland, that raised the most alarm. According to the New York Times, the Kremlin later reported that the leaders reached important agreements. But American government officials were left in the dark. American intelligence agencies were left to glean details about the meeting from surveillance of Russians who talked about it afterward. I'm joined now by U.S. Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas, who sits on the House Intelligence Committee, and Natasha Bertrand is a staff writer at The Atlantic. I want to go to Natasha on this. Put it together, the New York Times story on last weekend, the Washington Post story, and now the latest by the New York Times, all about the way in which our president has secreted his meetings with Putin.
Right. So I think that it just lends more credence to the FBI's decision to open a counterintelligence investigation into whether the president is acting as an agent or is an agent of Russia. I think that every policy decision that he's made really needs to be examined within the context of his love for Vladimir Putin, his inability to criticize him in any way, his secretiveness when it comes to his meetings with the Russian president, his desire to keep even his own staff in the dark about those conversations. This is not something that's normal for presidents, right? Especially when you're dealing with a foreign adversary. You want your staff in the administration to know what was said in those meetings in case there's any misunderstandings that arise later. And so I think that what we're learning now about Trump's repeated efforts really beginning and, well, not beginning, but intensifying during that Oval Office meeting that he had with Sergei Kislyak and the Russians, in which he said that firing Comey, the former FBI director, took great pressure off him, is something that...
Why would a president say to a foreign leader, even an adversary, yeah, I'm glad I got rid of that guy that was looking into our relationship?
Well, that's the big question. There really seems to be only one answer to that, which is that he now feels freer to communicate with the Russians without investigative scrutiny.
Congressman, if we had a Manchurian candidate, someone who was a mole in our government at the highest level, the presidency, they would do things like, well, leave the troops out, pull the troops out of Syria because Russia doesn't want them there. They would kill NATO, which has been a burr in the saddle of the Russians since Stalin's day, because it's kept Western Europe from them and eventually took part of Eastern Europe away from them, including the Baltic states, Poland, and Hungary. They hate NATO. He's talking about getting rid of it. It sounds like he matches up with someone working for the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government could not have asked for a friendlier American president who has done the things that you mentioned, undermined our relationship with longstanding allies, entertained the idea of actually withdrawing from NATO, aligned himself with autocrats around the world, including Vladimir Putin, obviously, pulled out of Syria in a haphazard way, leaving it to one of the countries there, Russia, to control. And so he's done things that have substantially departed from the behavior of both Republican and Democratic presidents and undermined our standing in the world to Russia's benefit. It should also be noted, Chris, that Donald Trump started going to Moscow, to Russia, before the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so, I mean, of course, we're far from having a conclusion on this or anything definitive, but you also got to admit that that's exactly the kind of person that they would be targeting to make an asset of in the United States. So we're a long way from figuring this out, I think, but it speaks to the urgency of getting that interpreter, probably subpoenaing the interpreter, and figuring out what was said in that meeting in Helsinki.
What do you make of, big picture, what do you make of his strange attraction to Moscow? You know, he wants to have a tower over there, a hotel. He wants to have he had the Miss Universe contest over there. He's got 100 contacts during his campaign in early parts of administration with Russians. He's got people he's hired like Manafort, and he hangs around people like Roger Stone, all of them with Russian Papadopoulos, all these people with Russian contacts. I said it last night, not to be lighthearted about it. I don't know any Russians. Why does he know so many Russians? I don't know how many you happen to know, but it's an odd. I mean, a lot of us meet Mexicans. We meet people from Canada. We meet people from Europe, Western Europe. We don't meet a whole lot of Russians, and this guy seems to spend his life with them. He seems to have an affinity for the East. Like, what is this about this guy? I don't know. I'd love to know.
Yeah, I wish I could give you a more definitive answer. One of the things that we tried to figure out in our investigation on the Intelligence Committee is whether there was any money laundering issues between the Trump organization and Russian oligarchs, for example, who were pumping money into President Trump's businesses. But as you know, Devin Nunes, who was chair of the committee, didn't issue a single subpoena for bank records, travel records, phone records, anything that would allow us to get to the bottom of the question about the history between President Trump and Russia and the organization in Russia, and whether they have any leverage over Donald Trump. Yeah. That's something that I hope that Bob Mueller has figured out. But now that we've got a different control, Democrats are in control of this Intelligence Committee, we'll go about trying to figure it out as well.
How much more are you worried about the dossier, including all its gory pieces, being true, given what happened in the newspapers this weekend, that the FBI began to think he was a mole, and then you read the dossier. Do you read it in a new light, a new credible light?
Yeah, I think that the reporting tends to strengthen some of the claims that were made in the dossier. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, just before Trump's first meeting with Putin back at that G20 summit, the New York Times contacted the White House about a story they had set to publish. That story would reveal for the first time that Donald Trump Jr. met with a Kremlin lawyer at Trump Tower in June of 2016. We know about that meeting. Well, just hours after that call, Trump and Putin held these two meetings in Hamburg. This is in July of 17, the details of which are still shrouded in secrecy. And then on his flight home the next day, the president personally drafted a misleading response to the New York Times for his son, saying the Trump Tower meeting of June 16 was about the adoption of Russian children, not the promise of Russian dirt on Hillary Clinton. Coincidentally, when asked what he discussed privately with Putin, Trump also said he discussed Russian adoption.
While I was there, I said hello to Putin. Really pleasantries more than anything else. Was not a long conversation, but it was, could be 15 minutes, just talked about things. It was very interesting. We talked about adoption. I actually talked about Russian adoption with him, which is interesting because that was a part of the conversation that Don had with us meeting.
Was he using Putin to cover for his son's meeting and say, we're just talking adoption, just like my son was?
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it? I guess that's one word for it. But I think it's worth remembering that the White House did not even actually confirm that this conversation happened until 10 days later. This was not something that they wanted to come out in the press. And, the Times didn't really follow up on Trump's comment that he had discussed adoptions with Putin at the dinner the